Poteet, and I am the Chief Curator at the North Carolina Museum of History. I'd like to welcome you to our Coffee with the Curator program this morning. This is a new series we have where once a month you can come in the morning and talk with a curator. I hope you enjoy it. It's a great way to start your day. Today's topic will be about the women's suffrage movement in North Carolina. I do want to remind you that your cameras are off and your microphones are muted, but we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and we'll answer them then. Okay, I'm going to switch on over to my presentation and we'll get going. So today I'm going to be talking about the women's suffrage movement in North Carolina, and that is, we do have an exhibit right now called "You Have to Start a Thing" about the movement, and it is based on the struggle to pass the 19th Amendment in North Carolina and nationally, and of course it is up because of the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of that this year from 1920 to 2020. The exhibit is on our lobby level, and I hope you've either had a chance to see it or will be able to come and see it. It'll be up through early August. It has three basic sections. In one of them, we talk about the national story, and one we talk about the movement in North Carolina and how it was a little bit different from the national story. And then in the final section, we talk about what happened after 1920. And as we know, in North Carolina, 1920, just that white women could vote. It took until the 1965 Voting Rights Act before women of color in North Carolina could vote. So that final section talks about that story, about passage or non-passage of the ERA in North Carolina, and about how women in politics took a while to really get going as far as getting into statewide office. So I hope you'll be able to come and see the exhibit, but today we're really going to focus on that central portion, which is about the fight for suffrage in North Carolina. And specifically, we're going to meet some of the people who were part of that fight, but I did just want to give you a little bit of background. We can't talk about the fight for women's suffrage in North Carolina or the South without talking about white supremacy. It was a central tenet to the struggle. In the South, people did not want to reopen the question of could vote. They had been successfully suppressing the vote of African American men for several decades at this point, and they really did not want a federal amendment or the federal government coming in and questioning who could vote and opening that back up in. So both the suffragists and the anti-suffragists in North Carolina are very aware of that. You have suffrage that give white women will actually help preserve white supremacy. You have anti-suffragists who are saying that giving the vote to women will destroy white supremacy. So that argument is going back and forth. The other arguments are here as well. You know, is the vote going to ruin the family? Is it going to destroy the position of women in society? Or are women to clean up politics, and do they deserve the right to have a say in their own country? They pay taxes. All that's going back and forth as well. But the white supremacy is really the underlying factor in the South and in North Carolina. One of the other major differences here is that fighting for suffrage looked a little bit different. If you can see these pictures on the screen here, these are two of the most well-known pictures of North Carolina suffragists that we have. Gertrude Wheel, who is probably the best known North Carolina suffragist, is pictured in both. She's on the left in both pictures, and she donated these to the state archives, which is why they still exist for us. The picture on the left is what we kind of think of suffragists looking like. They're in white dresses, they're wearing sashes. However, this is the only photo we have of North Carolina suffragists wearing sashes, looking like they are out to parade for suffrage. We don't have any written accounts of any suffrage parades or marches in North Carolina. It just wasn't the way things were done in the South. It was much more conservative here. The picture on the right is actually much more what was going on and how these men and women were fighting for suffrage. You see the woman seated at a desk at a typewriter, writing the letters, writing the newspaper articles, writing the speeches, working to convince people to support suffrage, sort of behind the scenes instead of very actively out marching or picketing. None of that was really going on here in North Carolina. So here is a look at some of the people that we're going to meet today. I get very excited about this topic. One of the things that I really enjoyed about working on this exhibit was getting to do the background research to sort of reintroduce these people again. There hasn't been a lot of work done on the suffrage movement, specifically in North Carolina, and a lot of the people who were involved in it have been sort of forgotten over time. Their role has sort of slipped out of the public memory. So doing this exhibit was a great way to bring back some of these people, and I wanted to take the opportunity today to introduce you to a lot of them and just sort of give you an idea of who was working for suffrage. Um, Two things that you might notice about this photo or this group of photographs. One is that there are very few African American faces. Um, we know that there were lots of Black suffragists nationally, but in the South and in North Carolina in particular, there were very few women who were openly speaking about suffrage, or African American women openly speaking about suffrage, especially before 1920. Else you might notice is that some of the pictures are bad. We really wanted to show the people that we were talking about in this exhibit, but we had a hard time finding images of a lot of the women. Sometimes the only place that you can find an image is maybe a bad newspaper reprint or taking a picture from a yearbook. Until very recently, archives and museums really didn't find it important to keep pictures of women. They just weren't considered newsworthy enough. So we did have to go back and search hard, and I apologize, some of the pictures aren't great, but we felt it was important to show whatever images we had to really bring these stories back to the forefront again. All right, let's take a look at who some of these people are. We're going to jump back to the beginning of the story in North Carolina. You are probably familiar with 1848, Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susie Anthony, those big names of the suffrage movement, starting to do their work in sort of the mid 1800s. That is not happening in the South. There is very little talk about suffrage in the South, anywhere in the South before the 1890s, and nothing in North Carolina before almost the mid 1890s. However, around that time period, we have Helen Morris Lewis, who you can see down on the bottom left, who is actually a South Carolinian, but is living in Asheville at the time. And she and her friend, Floride Cunningham, decide that they're going to hold a public meeting to call for suffrage. They did this in the Buncombe County Courthouse, which you can see there. And we even still have one of the original flyers preserved, which I think is awesome. They gave this speech. They were introduced by the mayor, who was supporting them. The newspapers talked about how they had a rather surprisingly good crowd for the speech. And a week later, they met at that same mayor's house and formed the North Carolina Equal Rights Association. So that's the first statewide league in North Carolina. They called it a statewide league. Actually, most of the members were just from the Asheville area. Helen went around giving speeches sort of in the local area, and she was active nationally in the movement. But by around 1900, that organization had petered out. Another woman that we know of who was active in the movement at the time is Lila Barnwell. Here's a good example of those people we can only find a newspaper image for. She was also in the mountains in the Hendersonville area. She attended some of those national meetings as well. She stayed active in the movement all the way through up to 1920 and actually ran for local office in her town for town council in 1921, but was defeated. Actually, Helen Morris Lewis is the first woman that we know of who ran for office. She ran for a local office in Asheville in 1899 and was defeated as well. On the right, you can see Anna Julia Cooper. She is an African-American woman who was born enslaved in Raleigh, got her education at St. Aug's, and then went on to become the fourth African-American woman to a PhD. In 1892, she published the book A Voice from the South, which is considered one of the earliest Black feminist books. And in it, she actively called for African-American women to have the right to vote. But of course, by the time she was publishing in 1892, it's the same time that there's a little bit of activism going on in North Carolina, but by then she was living in Washington, D.C. So as I said, that movement petered out around 1900. And so we have over a decade where very little is happening about suffrage in North Carolina. But then in October of 1913, we have a state league reforming. I will point out that that makes North Carolina the very last state to establish a permanent state league for suffrage. 7 women got together in Charlotte and called for this statewide league that began it with around 40 members, men and women. You can see the image here on the float is a great image that we have. 3 of those original founders are on the float. This is not in a suffrage parade, however, it is in another parade that's going on in Charlotte, but this is the only image of even a suffrage float that we have in North Carolina. So some of the women who were part of this early movement, Anna Forbes Liddell and Susan Forney Bynum, were the two active voices that called for this group to be formed. And they had some big roles in publicity early on and in trying to spread the movement across the state. Laura Holmes Riley, down on the bottom left there, was very big in the women's club movement in the state. She was very socially prominent. She actually spoke before the legislature in 1915 and 1917 calling for suffrage. Annie Abbott was also a Charlottean, very involved in the YWCA there in her community and in the women's club movement. She was one of those founders. Mary Bell Palmer, who was the librarian at the local Carnegie Library, and she actually enabled the women to come and meet in the library. So the organization was formed at the local library, and she became the first treasurer of the State League. So we have this going on in 1913. That there are two local leagues, and then you have the State League formed, and then you have local leagues forming out across the state in 1913, 14, 15. So these are some of the women who were involved early on. Mary Henderson at the top left there. Her brother was a professor at UNC, and the woman beneath her, Barbara Henderson, is her sister-in-law. Their whole family was very active in the movement. On the previous page where we saw Suzanne Bynum, that is Mary's sister. And later on, when we are talking about a few of the men who were involved, we'll see Archibald Henderson, Barbara's husband. All of them were very prominent as far as calling for suffrage. Mary Henderson was actually the first legislative liaison for the statewide group. She came to Raleigh in 1915 and was instrumental in helping craft some legislation, none of which passed, but legislation that would have benefited women at the time. Her sister-in-law, Barbara Henderson, was the first president of the statewide league. She was very vocal in coming out and saying that the women of North Carolina really wanted the vote to be given to them by their men. They were, calling on the chivalry of the men of North Carolina to offer them the right to vote. She comes out and sort of breaks ties with any militant suffragists. She wants to make it clear that in North Carolina, women really want to work within the system and want that vote to be given to them by their menfolk. I love the image that she uses for publicity. This is one that you can find published in newspapers and zines at the time. She's very consciously, I believe, choosing this image where she is pictured as a young, beautiful mother, could not be less threatened to society, asking for the right to vote. Two other relatives that we know of that were working for suffrage early on, we have Kate Voppel Hotsfeld and Jessie Voppel Bicknell. These were sisters who had moved from the Midwest to North Carolina to the mountains. And Kate Hotsfeld was the president of the Morganton League. This league was actually the first local league formed in the state. They formed in July of 1913, so before that statewide league. Then her sister Jessie lived in the Linville Falls area, and she was a member of that and also wrote a column in the local newspaper supporting suffrage. And I love this image that we have of her in our collection because she has her pet duck Lancelot in it. So we have Mary Henderson was from Salisbury, Barbara Henderson was from Chapel Hill. Both the Voppel sisters lived in the mountains, and then we have an example here from down east, Lita Tunstall Rodman, who lived in Washington, and she was treasurer of the State League in 1915. So these leagues really are spreading all across the state, and women are becoming involved statewide. One of the things I wanted to do today was sort of take a look at, who suffragists were, what might have gotten them involved in the movement. In general, we know that most Suffs in North Carolina were well educated. A lot of them were college educated, and some had even gotten their education out of state and may have been exposed to suffrage out of state first. They tended to come from families in a rising middle class where people were involved in the professions, doctors, lawyers, newspapermen, retailers. A lot of these women worked outside the home, at least at some point in their lives. And a lot of them were involved in the women's club movement that I've mentioned already. Around 1900, it became socially acceptable in the South for women to join clubs, to sort of enter that public sphere a little bit more. It could be a book club or a choral club or a civic club. But in 1902, the North Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs was founded as sort of an umbrella organization And this group began lobbying the legislature for laws that benefited women and children. The women who were in that organization got a lot of experience being in a public organization, learning how to lobby the legislature, a lot of experience that was helpful in the women's suffrage movement. So some of the people that I wanted to highlight here, Gertrude Wheel, who we saw in those initial two photos about suffragists here. She is probably the best known suffragist in North Carolina. She was president of the state league in 1919 and 1920 when the fight over ratifying the amendment in North Carolina was going on. Maud Langdon, who was born out west. Her father was the territorial governor of Washington, and she actually voted when she lived there. She moved to Raleigh with her husband, who was in the Army, and she was one of the founding members of the Raleigh Equal Suffrage League, and served as its vice president and president. Clara Lingle, who was also very big in the Women's Club movement, she was serving as vice president of the State Suffrage League in 1915, and then as president of the Federation of Women's Clubs in 1915 to 1917. So she was one of those women that was working for suffrage, working in the Women's Club movement in very high levels. Also went on to become the first advisor to women students at UNC Chapel Hill as well. Speaking of education and educators, there were a lot of educators who were involved in the suffrage movement. On the left, we have Harriet Elliott, who was a professor at the State Normal and Industrial School, which is now UNCG. She came to North Carolina from Illinois, and she actually kept her address in Illinois so that she could maintain her right to vote for president there. She was a political science professor, and she introduced a lot of her students to the idea of suffrage. You can see the image above. She's on the top row, second one in from the right, and you can see her with a lot of her students holding those Vote for Women banners. So she did impress upon them the need to be involved in civics and government, and sort of brought the idea to suffrage to a wider audience there at the university. Louise Brevard Alexander is a fascinating person. She was the first female lawyer in Greensboro, the first female police person in North Carolina, a juvenile court judge, and eventually became a political science professor at what became UNCG, actually took that role on after Harriet Elliott retired. And she was very active in the Greensboro Suffrage League. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was the founder of Palmer Memorial Institute, which was a college prep school for African-American students. She was calling for suffrage in her speeches around 1920. She was very active in trying to register African-American women to vote, and spent her entire career trying to bring voting rights to African-Americans in the South as well. Sally Joyner Davis was a member of the initial faculty at ECU, and she was president of the local suffrage league in Greenville. We also had lots of women who were medical professionals. Dr. Delia Dixon Carroll on the left there was the first female doctor in Raleigh. She was also the official doctor for Meredith College. She traveled all around the state giving speeches for suffrage. She wrote in favor of suffrage, and she also appeared before the legislature in 1915 and 17, calling for suffrage as well. Dr. Annie Alexander was the first registered physician in the South, and she was a doctor in Charlotte. She was also the doctor for Presbyterian College, which is now Queen's University. And she was very active in the Charlotte League. Mary Marcus Houston came from north with her husband, who was an Episcopal minister. They came to the mountains to establish ministry there, and then helped found Grace Hospital, where she was an administrator for many years. And she was one of the founding members of that Morganton League that I mentioned, one of the first local leagues in the state. We have lots of women in other professions who were part of this movement. Margaret Collick Berry was the first woman to graduate from law school at UNC Chapel Hill, and the first woman to argue successfully. Well, the first woman to argue a case before the state Supreme Court, and she did win that case. Mamie Fairbrother was a journalist. She and her husband ran a newspaper called Everything in Greensboro, and she used her part of the paper to chronicle the women's club movement and to chronicle the suffrage movement and to call for suffrage, and was active in that Greensboro League as well. Margaret Busby Shipp, she was widowed early on and had young children, and began to support herself by writing articles. She had articles published in lots of national newspapers. And she was a very active member of the Raleigh Suffrage League. Elsie Riddick was also a member of that Raleigh League, and on to become president of the Wake County League of Women Voters after women had the right to vote. She started out her career as a stenographer in state government and then sort of moved up in government and spent her entire career working for state government. Kate Bird Johnson was very active in the women's club movement, but was also a social worker. And she became the first female commissioner of public welfare in our state, and therefore also became the first woman to run a state agency in 1921. We had additionally women who were involved in the movement, and then that got them involved in politics. So Cornelia German was, again, very active in the women's club movement, very active member of the Suffrage League in Raleigh. She was actually the legislative liaison in 1919 and 1920 when a lot of that lobbying of legislators was going on for passage of the, or attempted passage of the amendment in North Carolina. And then she went on after women got the right to vote, and she became the first female speaker, or first female to speak as a delegate to the state Democratic Convention, and then also served as a delegate from the state to the National Democratic Convention 3 different times in the 1920s. When she died, the News and Observer called her the state's first woman for all of the work she had done for North Carolina. Lula Robert Platt was from Syria. Her husband died while she was fairly young, and so she ran a hotel to support her family. But she also got very interested in suffrage. She was the second president of the statewide league. And then after women had the right to vote, she ran in 1922 and 1924 for the state Senate, although she did lose both times. But Lillian Exum Clement is our state's first female legislator. She was also from the Asheville area, also very active in the Asheville League. She was one of our state's earliest female attorneys, and she ran to be the representative from her area actually before women could vote. So her primary in 1920 was in the spring before women could vote, but then she was elected in the fall when women did have the right to vote in 1920. It's interesting to note that she is actually where the title from our exhibit comes from. When she first came to Raleigh to serve in the legislature, she was interviewed by the News and Observer, and they asked her what it felt like to be the first female, and she said that I know there will be many other women in politics, but you have to start a thing. Have to start a thing for the exhibit title. Now, there were North Carolinians who were not fighting for suffrage in North Carolina. We have a group of women who were expats that were living mainly in the DC area who were fighting there. Most of the women who were there and all the women pictured here were members of the National Woman's Party. There were 2 different groups fighting for suffrage at the time. The National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul, was what people considered the militant party. They were the ones picketing the White House, the ones being arrested, being force-fed while they were in jail. All that story of suffrage is coming from the National Woman's Party. The other group is the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and they are the larger group, and that's the group that most North Carolinians were associated with, and they're working for suffrage in a more conservative manner, sort of working through the power structure. But these women are from the National Woman's Party, and you can see that Virginia Arnold down in the bottom left corner. We have a great image of her standing with one of her banners. That's the Kaiser Wilson, complaining that Wilson is fighting for democracy abroad while not supporting the right to vote for women in America. She was from North Carolina. Her father was a minister. She had lived all around in North Carolina. But by the time she was involved in the suffrage movement, she was living in DC, working for the National Woman's Party, being sent out all across the country. She also picketed the White House and was arrested during that time. Mildred Coombs above her was actually not a North Carolinian, but her father was from New Bern. And at the time, both organizations were quick to claim anybody from the South because they wanted to make it seem like they had more support in the South than they really did initially. Mildred was the chief news girl for the Suffragists, which was the paper the National Woman's Party put out in 1913. In 1914, an image of her went out in newspapers all across the country where she was called the Beauty of Suffrage Headquarters. Another thing these groups did was promote their young, beautiful women as a way to make suffrage seem very non-threatening to society. Araminta, or Minta Jones, there on the top, is from Charlotte, and she was going to prep school in DC, so she got involved with the groups there. She was one of the few women who was an active member of the National Woman's Party and NAWSA at the same time, held offices for both groups, and was the press person for NAWSA early on in North Carolina in 1914 1914 and also took part in one of the big national parades representing North Carolina in 1914. Beneath her, we have Minnehaha, or Minnie Brooke. She was from Roanoke Island, went to Trinity before it was Duke, moved with her husband to DC, and there she was very active in the National Woman's Party and was known as a street speaker. She would stand on street corners and argue for suffrage. Ella Clapp Thompson founded one of the first local groups in Bakersfield and then went on to be a national organizer for the National Woman's Party and traveled all across the country fighting for suffrage. And here I didn't want to leave out the men. As I said, it was very important for the women in North Carolina to have the support of men. At one point in time, the State League claimed on their letterhead that they showed 99 male supporters on their letterhead because they really wanted to get that point across, that they were working through the current power structure and that they were supported by important men in the state. So some of those men who actively supported suffrage, Thomas Patton is the mayor that we talked about at the very beginning in the 1890s in Asheville. He introduced that speech. He let the club form at his house. And at the time, he was one of very few men who were actively supporting suffrage in the open in North Carolina. Chief Justice Walter Clark was the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. He was a very vocal, probably the most vocal male supporter of suffrage in the state. His daughter was an active suffragist in Raleigh. He went around giving speeches all the time, gave annual speeches for the state league. They would publish his speeches to distribute them. And then Archibald Henderson, of course, we mentioned earlier, was the husband of Barbara Henderson, the first president of the state league, brother of one of the very early active suffragists, and brother-in-law and son-in-law of two of the women that formed the state league. He was a professor at UNC, and he took lots of opportunities as well to travel with his wife, spoke in favor of suffrage, and wrote in favor of women's suffrage. So if you have enjoyed this and would like to know a little bit more about these people and you're able to come to the exhibit, we do have an interactive there. We call it They Fought to Vote, What Will You Fight For? There's a mirror there so you can see yourself in it. And then beneath that mirror, there is an interactive where you can find out a little bit more information about these people. As you can see, the interactive, we cover people who fought for the right to vote all the way up through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This morning, I just wanted to focus on those women who were fighting particularly before 1920. So I am going to unshare now, and I will take any questions that anybody has. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, no, some have popped in. Okay. Let's see. In addition to white supremacy, what other factors explain the motivation of anti-suffrage women in North Carolina? That's a great question. And a lot of it had to do primarily with white supremacy. But a lot of the anti-suffragist women were tied to families who were economically going to be impacted or feared they would be impacted by women getting the right to vote. So for instance, anybody who was involved in the textile mill industry, the railroad industry, large land holdings, all of those people feared that women might vote to support labor laws that would cost them money. And so a lot of times that support was very tied to where your family made its money. In general, aunties also tended to fear the breakdown of society, tied to that white supremacy as well. They tended to be, not as well educated, or maybe hadn't been educated outside the state as much, tended not to have worked outside the home. So there was a lot of things that went into that support for anti-suffragism, but really the two main ones would be white supremacy and, your family business almost. We don't know that much. There's the question here about how anti-suffragists voted once they were enfranchised. We don't have a lot of good records showing that. We do know that the leader of the anti-suffrage movement in North Carolina, after suffrage was passed, was quick to say, well, we didn't want this, but we are sure as going to figure out how to vote, and we will be active in our voting so that our views are part of or getting across in our democracy. There was a lot of early on people saying that women would clean up politics if they got the right to vote, and the antis would say that women were going to destroy or be destroyed by, be dirtied by politics. There was a lot of thought that women would vote only on women's issues, and none of that, of course, turned out to be true. Women are not a voting bloc. They are just part of the electorate the same way that men are, and they vote in different ways, and that's what sort of came out over time. Oh, I see a question about, can I say more about the battalion of male sympathizers? I wish I could. I have looked into that photo. We know nothing about what is going on in that photo. Gertrude Wheel donated it to the archives, but she identified two women in it. Both of them, they were sisters and they lived in Goldsboro. She did not identify any of the other people. My assumption is that that photo was taken in Goldsboro just because that's where Gertrude lived as well. There are no descriptions in the local newspapers of any kind of event for me to know what they were doing and why they were that way, why they were all in the photo together. We do not know who the man was. You know, was he related to one of the women? And there are no written records that mention that battalion of male sympathizers at all. So unfortunately, it is a very intriguing question that we just don't have a good answer for. This presentation will be saved online and you'll be able to access it through our website. Let's see. Oh, that's been answered in the chat already. Let's see. I do have one question that I've sort of answered already. Once women's suffrage was passed, did a lot of North Carolina women vote, and were they harassed for voting? Yes, women did vote. We don't have great figures on how many, and I don't know of any instances of them being harassed for voting, apart from, of course, African American women who tried to register but often ran into problems registering as part of that Jim Crow voter suppression. Okay, I think, let's see. Did North Carolina newspapers cover the work of the National Woman's Party? Yes, people in North Carolina were very aware of the National Woman's Party, and the NAWSA affiliated women were very vocal in saying that they were not militants and they did not support that. They were afraid that any support for that more militant group who was protesting throughout World War I and lost a lot of favor for doing that, they did not want to be associated with them. They knew that was not helping them win over people in North Carolina. So yes, all that was covered in the local papers. In fact, Virginia Arnold, the woman that we saw who was holding the banner, there's a lot of coverage about her when she is arrested and when she's working for the National Woman's Party. She was actually the step-niece of Chief Justice Walter Clark. We saw that very vocal male supporter, and he came out in the papers and sort of half-heartedly supported her. But even then, he was trying to keep away from her a little bit because that National Woman's Party was so unpopular here in North Carolina. Okay, I think we are about out of time here today. I appreciate so much you joining us today, and I hope you've enjoyed it. We hope that you will come back next month and come to another Coffee with a Curator with us. Have a great day. Thank you.